I can turn that off. One sec. Hello, everyone. You're listening to the Citizen Truth podcast. I'm very excited today to speak with Laurence Shoup, a decades-long peace and labor activist and outstanding scholar of U.S. capitalism, imperialism, and the U.S. ruling class, specifically in his most recent book, Through the Council on Foreign Relations. So today we're going to just go over the influence of the council on contemporary U.S. policy, and So, Mr. Shoup, could you please start with a short overview of the council's historic role influencing U.S. foreign policy?
Yes, and thank you for having me, Peter. It's very nice to be on this podcast. First, we need to understand that the Council on Foreign Relations is a private organization. It works behind the scenes in large part, but you can find out about it. If anyone wants to know more about the council, they can, of course, look at my book, Wall Street's Think Tank, but in my earlier book, Imperial Brain Trust. But you can also, go on the CFR website, cfr.org. So it's not, oftentimes people say, well, is this a conspiracy? No, the CFR is like the union of the capitalist class allied with the professional class. It's their union. So it's not a conspiracy in any sense. You can find out information about it, but it is a private organization and its membership is individual and corporate. So it has members and it's a think tank, both of those things. The members go to meetings, usually with world leaders, but also US leaders. Then they do a think tank. They have study groups where they see a world problem or a US problem, and then they bring together a diverse group of people from the council, sometimes people from outside the council, to study that. And this has been going on since the First World War period. The first council was started in 1918. It was just a businessman's group that wanted to expand their influence abroad, to invest abroad. Then that was the first council in 1918. Then in 1919, the peace conference at Versailles, the British and the US delegations met, and they decided to form two organizations, one in Britain, which became Chatham House, and one in the United States, which became the Council on Foreign Relations, which that was an experts group, the group that met with the British at Versailles in 1919. It was an experts group, and the businessmen groups met with the experts group and decided to form a unified group. So the Council on Foreign Relations is an alliance between the capitalist class, that is the business and billionaires, and professionals, especially in scholarly realms, such as Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Columbia, Johns Hopkins, Chicago, Stanford. Those are the main universities that the Council on Foreign Relations professionals work with. So we have a capitalist class that runs the organization. If you look at the leadership of the organization throughout history, and it's over 100 years old now, this organization, the leadership is mostly finance capitalists. It originally was the Morgan interests were more prominent in the Council on Foreign Relations. Then the Rockefeller interests became more prominent. Now it seems to be private equity, which is more, we'll get back to private equity later, but private equity seems to be the most, it's finance capital, another form of finance capital, more modern form of finance capital that's dominant in the Council on Foreign Relations. So this is in contrast, if you're talking about the capitalist class, you're talking about people who don't have to work. They can sit motionless 24 hours a day and the money pours in because they have investments. They own land, they own properties, they own stocks and bonds, they own businesses. They're making money whether they work or not. Now, a lot of them do like to work. They like to work in their own businesses where they're in charge. And they can order around the professional class and they can order around the working class. I see the United States as a class society, of course. Identity politics, to me, is a diversion. It has its place, but the real thing and the most important thing is it's a class society run by the capitalist class, the people who don't have to work. And they ally themselves with professionals from these universities and other types of professionals too, media professionals, journalists, etc. They have other businesses besides finance capital that are involved. Government people are in the Council on Foreign Relations, both current government and retired ones. So they have a diverse group of people that they work with. but it's not much in the way of working class people. They used to have some union leaders were in the Council on Foreign Relations, including the head of the AFL-CIO at different times. Sweeney was the last one, the head of the AFL-CIO, which was in the council. But currently, no, the labor movement does not have much role in the council. In fact, the left in general, worldwide and in this country, has been weakened severely. And of course, this allows the capitalists to do what they want in terms of tax breaks, in terms of exploiting the working class. And we see that in the results. The billionaires, are getting more and more billions, whereas the working class is just barely holding their own, and if not declining. So then the history of the council, like I say, it was merged, these two different groups in 1921. Then their journal, that's another aspect of the council. Besides think tanks and publications, they have all these staff people, a big budget. Their president, for example, makes almost $1 million a year, Richard Haas. His income is from the council is almost $1 million a year, because they pay pretty well for their staff people. They got a lot of staff people, and they write books, involved in the study group program, and that's how they operate, with a lot of money and a lot of finance capital involved. And so their history, the Foreign Affairs is their magazine, and they have some of their staff people write articles for Foreign Affairs, but it's broader. The council is a debate organization to some extent. They have these ruling class people, as capitalist class people that dominate, but they want ideas from the other segments of society, especially the professional class, the university people, to help them out of their problems that they have. So they bring them in, and they write articles for Foreign Affairs. So if you want to know about some of the council's ideas, Foreign Affairs magazine. They also promote politicians in Foreign Affairs magazines. For example, in the last election, 2020 election, they allowed 2 presidential candidates to have an article in Foreign Affairs. Now, Foreign Affairs is read, not just in the United States, by hundreds of thousands of people, maybe even millions, because subscribers aren't the only people that read Foreign Affairs, but worldwide. So anyway, they allowed 2 people in 2020. It was Elizabeth Warren and Joe Biden. Donald Trump was not allowed. I'm sure he would have liked to write an article for Foreign Affairs. Of course, he has his own writers. He wouldn't write it himself. He's basically an idiot, but he would have his own writers write something, some kind of nonsense. But they didn't want him in the Foreign Affairs. So it's just Elizabeth Warren, which some of them saw as kind of an option. If Bernie Sanders got too strong, then Elizabeth Warren would be the one that they put in. And of course, when Trump made his speech, one of his State of the Unions, and said, there'll be no socialism in America, Elizabeth Warren stood up and gave applause for that. She got a standing ovation for there'll be no socialism in America. Bernie Sanders did not stand up and give a standing ovation to that. So they wanted to stop Sanders. They didn't know if Biden could do it. So let's give Elizabeth Warren some publicity. But that's not their main shtick. Their main shtick is to plan ahead, to provide policy ideas for those people in power, and then the policy ideas, get control through the media, through the universities, through the Foreign Affairs, through articles, through newspaper articles, through the books that people write. They get their policy ideas out. So what are some of their policy ideas historically? In the 20s, they were very focused on alliance with Britain, and they said that Britain was the dominant world power still in the 1920s, and even into the 1930s, until US and Germany and Russia, Soviet Union became more important. And they saw the Council on Foreign Relations has always been about world domination for the United States. And they saw that Britain was weakening and the US was going to take over. So the US had the natural right of succession. They even said this: we have the natural right of succession to the British Empire. We're going to take over from the British Empire. So that during the 20s and 30s, they wanted to hold that together, an alliance with Britain. And they also had books that came out like Ores and Industry of the Far East. That was the purpose of that. This was a CFR member that wrote a book from a study group in the CFR in the 1920s, Ores and Industry of the Far East. Well, that was an investment vehicle. They could look at that book and say, oh yeah, India's got this and this, China has this and this, Indonesia has this, or Dutch colony at that time, Japan has something that we can invest in. So there was book for investment. They weren't really as powerful in that period. And they really only came of age in World War II. And to give you an idea of the Council's ambition, war broke out on September 1st, 1939. Germany attacked Poland. 12 days later, the Council on Foreign Relations leaders were meeting with State Department leaders saying, what's the post-war world going to look like? The United States is still over 2 years away from being in the war, and they're talking about, let's work on the post-war world order. We'll work on US war aims, we'll work on other countries' war aims, and we'll work out the post-war world order now, and beginning now in 1939. Well, they were supported by the Rockefeller Foundation, who gave hundreds of thousands of dollars. There's a lot of money in 1939, 1940, 41. It continued to 1945, and they had over 600 memos that they wrote based on their study groups that they had on the war peace studies, U.S. aims and war aims and the war peace studies that existed from 1939 to 1945. And what came out of that fairly early, they did a lot of studies, and they said, well, what's the minimum living space? Hitler's got his living space. He wants to take over Eastern Europe and Russia and the Soviet Union. That's his living space, Lebensraum. Well, what's our living space? How much area do we have to control to be dominant in the world? So they and have a good economy and lots of prosperity, but not just for ourselves, especially for the capitalists, but also we want to make sure the working class doesn't rebel. So we have to give them some crumbs at least off the table. So we want a big table. So what's our minimum living space? So they said, well, Germany's already taken over Europe. This was by 1940, they defeated France. This was coming out in 1940, late 40, early 41, and they called it the Grand Area. The Grand Area was the entire world, except for Western Europe, which was already under German control. They didn't have access to that. So that's the Grand Area. And we said, we have to have the Grand Area because that allows us enough resources, raw materials, enough places to invest capital, enough places to make profit, cheap labor in different places, China, et cetera, India, cheap labor. We can get workers to work for peanuts there. This is our area that we have to control. And they called it the Grand Area, the whole world, except the Western Europe. And the Soviet Union was included in the Grand Area also, yeah, but the rest, except for the Soviet Union and German-controlled Europe, the Grand Area was the rest of the world. We're going to defend that. Well, what does that lead to? Well, we can't let Japan have its greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere because that takes over some of the Grand Area. So we can't allow that. So there was a rival imperialist conflict going on in late 41, and the United States decided to do something tough. Let's cut off their oil. Japan won't have the oil. They can't go. They can't start advancing into Southeast Asia, which is part of the Grand Area. We don't want them to get there. They can't do that because they won't have any oil. So we cut off their oil, cut off their raw materials that we were giving them. But Japan had their own ideas. We're going to have our greater East Asia Coast prosperity sphere. And they did invade down in Southeast Asia. And at the same time, they attacked Pearl Harbor. And that, of course, provided a dilemma because the United States could declare war on Japan. But what about Germany? Well, Hitler solved that problem by declaring war by himself against the United States. So a few days later, Germany declared war, and it was a world war on two fronts for the United States. So the history of since that World War II period can be seen in US history and Council on Foreign Relations policy as attempts at world domination, continued world domination, defending the Grand Area and defending the open door for US investment, US resources. And you could take it all the way through. You could take it through Korean War. You don't want the Grand Area. That Korea is part of the Grand Area. We don't want it to be taken over. And Japan's part of the Grand Area too. If North Korea takes over all of Korea, that threatens Japan. if you look at Vietnam War, and there were continuous study groups from from the World War II period all the way through the late 1950s about Southeast Asia and its importance in Vietnam, the domino theory. And they always came to the conclusion, the same conclusion that Eisenhower came to. Eisenhower said, we need a lot of things down in Southeast Asia, rubber and tin. We need those resources, cheap labor, place to invest, place to send our production, one of our markets there. We need those things, he said in one of his press conferences in 1954. So that was the reason why the United States wanted to go into Vietnam, because it was being taken over and they didn't want. Now, they didn't want the Vietnamese to control their own country. They wanted to control the southern part of it. Now, of course, what's happened since, Vietnam's got a state capitalist system that doesn't mind to have some investment from other countries. They didn't know that at the time, but they wanted to defend the Grand Area. So Vietnam was part of that. Similarly, Iraq, the Council on Foreign Relations, as I show in my book, Wall Street's Think Tank, was totally, this is the book here, a Monthly Review Press, 2015, with an update in 2019. They were interested in the oil. The guy that wrote the Threatening Storm article, later book, The Case for Invading Iraq, he was CFR staff member, The Case for Invading Iraq. And he wrote that book, and then a year or two later, the United States invaded Iraq. It was all Council on Foreign Relations people that wanted to get into Iraq. And then later, this guy, his name is Pollock, Kenneth Pollock, he wrote an article for Foreign Affairs saying, it's the oil, stupid. Yeah, it was the oil. They wanted the oil there. They didn't want somebody else to get the oil, because the oil gives, control of oil gives the United States a big, hammer over other areas and countries. Europe, for example, is short of oil, short of resources. So where they get their oil becomes important. And that's why Russia, that's a problem now, because the conflict with Russia over Ukraine is leading to Europe being energy deficient. And so the United States wanted to keep control of the oil. If Saddam Hussein could get a hold of Kuwait, then later maybe threaten the world with nuclear weapons, which was all phony, but they wanted to make sure that they would control the oil. So they went into Iraq. And then you could go to Afghanistan and talk about the resources in Afghanistan. It wasn't quite as important as some of these other places, so they were more willing to make a compromise with the Taliban and decided to pull out after so many years. But this all, the history since then could be seen as defending the Grand Area. And so we could go into more on the CFR. Maybe I should give a few little vignettes on the CFR. One of them that comes to mind was given to us, and I wrote this book, Imperial Brain Trust, an earlier book, came out in 1977, Imperial Brain Trust. And I wrote with a guy named William Minter. We both did our dissertations, PhD dissertations on the Council on Foreign Relations. So he interviewed some council people, and he was able to interview the president, the ex-president of the CFR, of the Council on Foreign Relations. And he said, well, Minter asked him, my co-author, said, to this ex-president of the CFR, isn't the CFR very powerful? And the ex-president said, oh, no, we're not powerful at all. No, the council's not powerful. I'll give you an example of how we're not powerful. He said, when Eisenhower was at Columbia University in the late 40s, that's what, before he was president, he was in the Council on Foreign Relations, Eisenhower. And he was the president of Columbia University. And he went to the Council on Foreign Relations study group meetings. He came to one study group meeting in the late 1940s, cursing like only an ex-general could curse, And Dulles was there, Alan Dulles was there, of course. Dulles, interesting history to Dulles. He was a director of the Council on Foreign Relations for like 60 years, including when he was the head of the CIA. He was still a director of the Council on Foreign Relations. The intertie with the CIA and CFR is very strong. So anyway, he said, Ike, Dulles tells him, Ike, why are you so angry tonight? What's wrong? Oh, Truman has appointed me to head up the military in Europe, Supreme Command in Europe, and he has all these restrictions. He put these restrictions on me. No political contact with political leaders, for example. I don't like these restrictions. If I'm going to be the head of the military in Europe, I want to be able to do what I want to do. And Dulles says, calm down, Ike, calm down. Why don't you sit down over there on that desk and write out what your orders would like to be? What would you want to have your orders be? So Eisenhower writes this down, they type it up. Dulles takes the night train to Washington, meets with Averell Harriman, who's one of Truman's top advisors and a member of the CFR, gives him the memo from Eisenhower. Averell, this is what Ike would like to see, his orders. Would you give this to Harry for us, Harry Truman? It was the first thing on Truman's desk the next day. That's an example of how the Council on Foreign Relations doesn't have any power. And Truman says, Averell, do you agree with this? Harriman says, yeah, the council meeting decided this. Yeah, all the council people think this is a good idea. Okay, if you agree, I'll sign off on it. Truman signs it. So there's direct access to the president, immediate decision-making, immediate, and the guy, the president, ex-president said that's an example of no power. But what he meant was, he said to Minter, oh, it's just the people at the council that have power. The council doesn't have any power, the people there do. Well, that's pretty silly. The council brings the people together, gets them meeting, makes all the networks, the connections that you need to do this, and then says we have no power. Well, they have immense power. They have power right to the top, and they want world domination, and they've been successful in doing it for a very long time. So there's an example of the council's power. Now we have case studies. The Wall Street's think tank, Iraq, Imperial Brain Trust. We did a lot on Vietnam. There's a lot in here about, and they had for example, Lyndon Johnson had a senior advisory group, which wasn't known for a long time. The senior advisory group. Well, the chairman of the senior advisory group on Vietnam, that was advising him on Vietnam, telling him to escalate, keep escalating, so on and so on. Well, the chairman of the senior advisory group, which was not people in the government, these are people, I think there was one person that was in the government. The rest of them were all from retired or something, or businessmen or whatever. The chairman was the chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations, John J. McCloy, who also was the chairman of the Chase Manhattan Bank, the Rockefeller Bank. And when McCloy retired, David Rockefeller became the chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations. David Rockefeller, so he was chairman for 1965, I guess it was till 1985. Maybe it was 70 something, 72, I guess, to 1985 with David Rockefeller. Anyway, John J. McCloy was the head of the senior advisory group on Vietnam, which had almost all of the people on it were the Council on Foreign Relations. So there's another example of people advising the president, not in office, private group, but big capitalists like John J. McCloy, the head of the Chase Manhattan Bank, which is a very important bank, a lot of connections to the oil worldwide. That's another aspect of the council too. Other countries and leaders of other countries recognize the Council on Foreign Relations as a key player in the United States power structure. So if council has had groups that have gone to other countries, they always meet with the top people. They always get right in to talk to the president, the board, the big ministers of different segments of their economy, their politics. So they always are brought right in. If they go to Saudi Arabia, they meet with the king. If they go to Poland, they meet with the top leadership. Whatever, they always, these people know. And so they come and talk to the Council on Foreign Relations, leaders from other countries. So their program for the membership that has all these world leaders is pretty interesting for the membership. And then some people you wouldn't think we were in the council, like Daniel Ellsberg. No, Daniel Ellsberg lives here in the Bay Area where I live, and he saw my book and was interested in knowing me, so he invited me to dinner. So I asked him, Dan, why are you in the Council on Foreign Relations? He said, Larry, this place is very interesting. I get to New York a lot of times. Daniel Ellsberg's rich, by the way, married, multi-millionaire, maybe a billionaire, into a billionaire family. And so the Marx toy industry, the toy company. Anyway, Patricia Marx is his wife. So he says, I go to New York a lot. And when I go there, I like to go to the Council on Foreign Relations and meet world leaders or hear top leadership from the United States talking. So that's why I'm in the Council on Foreign Relations. Of course, in the earlier career, before he exposed the Vietnam War papers, the Pentagon papers, before he did that, he was, gung-ho. He was in Vietnam as a military Marine, and then he was a national security advisor of different kinds in different administrations. So he was the kind of person that the council brings in as their expertise, brings in for their professional class. And then, of course, he married into the capitalist class. So there's a few examples of the council's power, something up to date. I think we could maybe stop there. We've gone on for, over 20 minutes, probably 23 minutes or so. We can maybe go on to another question if you want, or maybe I could say a few more things about the council, but I think I've covered enough to they said strategic grand strategy, the council, they call themselves the premier organization in the world, the premier think tank. I would label it the most powerful think tank in the world, the most powerful private organization in the world. And my view, of course, isn't everybody's view. Other people have written on the council after we wrote Imperial Brain Trust. Well, then the academic scholars who want to, be the experts on the Council on Foreign Relations, they started writing articles and books on the council where they would narrow it down and just study, this aspect. So there's a book on the council and the overthrow of the Soviet Union, or not the overthrow of the Soviet Union, but the break with the Soviet Union in 1946, 47, 48. That's another aspect of the Grand Area. Of course, the Soviet Union should be destroyed because they're infringing on the Grand Area, the bigger Grand Area that they wanted. So they want world domination. That's their thing. So anyway, this overthrowing the Soviet was this academics' narrow focus on the council, and they're the ones that get cited. The radical interpretation, the working class interpretation, the correct, in my view, interpretation of the council doesn't get publicized. So if you go to WikiLeaks, they have they don't even have Wall Street think tank. Now they update sometimes and they may get it one of these days, but they haven't looked at Wall Street's think tank. But they have these other studies and then they use Imperial Brain Trust in footnotes, but they don't even cite it in the bibliography. They have these other Mickey Mouse or narrow studies or things from the council. The council writes its own history, so you can see their history. They have that, but they don't cover in any serious way the views that I'm putting out, because that's radical. And so that's why I didn't have a career teaching in the university. I taught in the university for a while, but then the word came down, well, Shoup, he's too radical, don't hire him. So then there was a blacklist out, and I never got hired again from being in the university. And that's happened to other scholars, Michael Parenti, Richard Wolff. There's a number of them that, if you're an expert in some area, like Noam Chomsky, well, he's genius in, linguistics. So they hesitate to fire him because he gets tenure. But somebody who's just focused on this kind of thing, radical interpretation of the US class system, the US ruling class, and how it exploits the working class and tries to get it and points out we can have a different world. They don't want to have that. So then I don't get teaching in the university. Luckily, my wife's an archaeologist and we're able to have our own business doing consulting. But a lot of people, they don't have that option. So they compromise with, if they're an academic, they don't want to rock the boat. So you don't hire Shoup because then you get tainted with this radical stuff. And then the people that run the university, which are big shots and lots of money usually, depends on the university. But anyway, they don't want to go into this. So that's probably enough of an overview. What else I might say? The nonprofit world and the legal world is also part of the Council on Foreign Relations. They're smaller numbers. And remember, I should mention, the Council is a very large organization. Their corporate membership is only a few hundred corporations, and it's the usual ones you would expect, the big banks, the big oil companies, the biggest ones, and some smaller ones too, the private equity firms, those are the membership for the corporate membership, but the individual membership is over 5,000 members. So it's a very big organization with some diversity in it. So they have some debate, but it's really run by and for the big finance capitalists and the ruling class. And if you look at the leadership historically and currently, it's those people that run the organization.
Okay, awesome. Thank you for that.
Shall we go on to the next question, maybe?
Yeah, no, that's a great backdrop. Yeah. So taking that historic perspective, how would you compare the CFR's influence on the Trump administration with their role in the Biden administration?
The Trump administration is, in my view, an outlier for the history of the Council on Foreign Relations, because every administration since Herbert Hoover has had Council on Foreign Relations people dominant in the administration. I go into that in Wall Street's think tank since the Carter administration. I show that it's always 60% to 90% of the top leadership is Council on Foreign Relations people in those administrations. Now, Trump is an outlier in the sense of there are Council on Foreign Relations people who supported Trump. There are Council on Foreign Relations people that were in the Trump administration. There are Council on Foreign Relations people that defend Trump in terms of his policies. But compared to these other administrations, the CFR in the Trump administration was quite weak. They had the transportation administration. That person was Elaine Chao, who's married to Mitch McConnell, by the way, the Republican leader in the Senate. She's been in the council for many decades. She was a CFR member in the administration, and two of his three national security advisors were CFR people: McMaster, H.R. McMaster, and John Bolton. So the two of his three national security advisors were, but the Secretary of States were not. They were council connected in a sense, but not, that is, through the corporate media, but they weren't, or the corporate membership of the council, but they weren't members themselves. Trump himself is not a member, whereas people like Clinton, Bill Clinton, and Eisenhower, they were members of the Council on Foreign Relations. So, and Nixon was a member of the Council on Foreign Relations as well. Of course, Kissinger, I didn't mention Kissinger, but Kissinger got his start in the Council on Foreign Relations. He was worked there in the 1950s, met the Rockefellers hired him, gave him a lot of money. Then Nixon took Kissinger away from the Rockefellers and brought him into his administration, and Kissinger became dominant force in American foreign policy for a long time. So Trump is an outlier in the sense that there are people there. His trade advisor, Robert Letzinger, he's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He was the World Bank head, and the head of the Federal Reserve, Powell, who Trump appointed. Those are members of they were members of the Council on Foreign Relations. But it wasn't overwhelming like it is other administrations. It's overwhelming. And Biden administration, it's overwhelming.
Yeah.
And I have an article in the Monthly Review magazine. Here, I got here somewhere. I guess I put it over here. Yeah, here it is. Biden and the Council on Foreign Relations. This is the May 2021 issue of Monthly Review. And you can get it on the internet. You don't have to buy the magazine. Just go on the internet, Monthly Review. It'll give you a list of options. And May 2021, Biden and the Council on Foreign Relations. It's the lead article in that issue. And that returns back to the usual situation where the top 30, I look at the top 30 advisors for Biden, and 17 of the top 30 are members or close to the Council on Foreign Relations in some way. That is, if they're not members themselves, their sister is a member or their wife is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. They're not exactly ignorant of the Council on Foreign Relations, or they've written article after article. In the case of Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, he's not a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He was more affiliated with Carnegie Institution, which is interlocked with the Council on Foreign Relations. There's Brookings, Carnegie, and the Council on Foreign Relations are very interlocked. And he wrote 5 articles for Foreign Affairs, and he's spoken at the Council numerous times. So I counted him as one of the 17. But most of the 17, I think 14 of the 17 are actual members of the Council on Foreign, 14 of the 30. And then there are other connections with Council on Foreign Relations connected people, strategic advisory groups like WestX, Albert Stonebridge, Cohen Consulting. These strategic advisory groups are consulting groups that help businesses get contracts and favors from the government. So there are a number of these people that are in the council, or maybe they're not in the council, but they're in these other strategic advisory groups that are very interlocked with the council. Corporations that are interlocked, top Wall Street firms, military industrial complex. For example, you wouldn't think Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense, you wouldn't think he'd be in the council. African-American man, he was in the military for his career. What's he doing in the council? Well, he knows where the power is. So he got in the Council on Foreign Relations at a fairly early date because that's the connection. So as soon as he left office, right away, he goes into something called West XX, West Executive, which is a company that helps get firms. And he became a part of the military industrial complex, one of the big military industrial complex organizations. So he brought his military expertise, started coining it and getting money out of it, like becoming a director of Raytheon. It was Raytheon. He became the director of Raytheon. The other one of these organizations that I cover in this article in Monthly Review in May of 2021 are the universities. And as I mentioned, there's certain universities, the top ones, the ones with the biggest amount of money, the biggest endowments, are Harvard, Yale, Stanford, Columbia, Oxford, Princeton, Chicago. And these same people, are connected. Like, just of the top 30 advisors that Biden has, 12 of them attended Harvard. Another 6 attended Yale. There's just those 2 make up 18 of the 30 of his top advisors, including all the foreign policy and key domestic policy, like Treasury Department. Janet Yellen, been a member of the Council on Foreign Relations for a long time. And I think she went to, I forget which one, Yale or Harvard, but she went to one of those. So these universities train these professors, professionals to serve the ruling class. And that's the way they get ahead. And they join the council too. And so altogether, 25 of the top 30 policymakers for Biden are closely connected to what I call the American plutocracy, or the ruling class. 25. Now, Biden's presenting this as diversity because he's basing it on identity politics. If someone's an African American or someone's a woman, well, then that's diversity. Even better if it's an African American woman. But those people are in the Council on Foreign Relations as well. And that's not real diversity. That kind of diversity hides the lack of diversity in the class connections and backgrounds of these people that are in Biden's administration. So the contrast is very sharp between Biden and Trump in terms of the Council on Foreign Relations. Not that Trump didn't have people from the council, he had quite a few, but Biden, it's overwhelming. And I was just dealing with the top 30 in this article. If you delve down, like in the Defense Department, Lloyd Austin is the head, but then they've got all these assistant secretaries of defense in different areas. Well, the one for the Far East is, of course, a Council on Foreign Relations member, etc. So if you delve down, you would find, I don't know how many hundreds of CFR people are in the Biden administration. Very large number, I'm sure. But this becomes something beyond what one individual can get into. We have over 5,000 members. I mean, how can you study all these people, one person? So I've kind of skimmed the surface in a sense, but we need a whole think tank. An anti-Council on Foreign Relations think tank is what we really need. Maybe young people will get onto this, look at Wall Street's think tank, look at Monthly Review, look at Imperial Brain Trust, and say, yeah, we need a think tank that studies the ruling class. That doesn't exist, and that devotes money and time. Of course, that's the problem. It would have to be funded by the rank and file, or unions maybe, because the ruling class is funding their own organizations. They're funding the CFR, they're funding Carnegie, they're funding Brookings, they're funding these other think tanks that serve their interests, that are part of their team, part of their union, the union of the between the professional class and the capitalist class, running the country and having a big to-do in terms of running the world. So that's how I would contrast those two. And I guess we could go on to the next question probably, because we
Sure. And I also thought it was interesting in
details.
there, the Blinken connection.
Yeah. About Blinken?
Yeah, how he had a
Tony
bunch of
Blinken?
family. He had a bunch of family.
Tony
members.
Blinken is, of course, in the Council on Foreign Relations, and not only him, but his father, his uncle, his wife are all in the Council on Foreign Relations.
Yeah.
John Kerry is another one that's one of the top 30. He's the advisor on climate for Biden. His wife, his son, his daughter are all in the Council on Foreign Relations. So it becomes a family affair for many of these families. And when we talk about Colby a little bit, if we get into the strategy of
Yeah,
denial,
absolutely.
the same thing. His grandfather's in the Council on Foreign Relations, his father's in, and he's in, and the Colby family goes way back. So it becomes a family deal. And Blinken, of course, was part of was one of the founders of this West X, which included Averill Haines, which is the what do they call it? There's a special name for it. It's not the CIA, but it's the
Director of Intelligence.
Director of Intelligence. She was a founder of West X. Austin, the Secretary of Defense, now was one of the founders, and this Blinken was one of the founders of West Exec, which is a private organization that says we'll help you give us money and be part of our team, and we'll help you get government contracts. So they get money from big corporations too for advice. They give them advice on various things, and it's the connections, it's the network that goes into this. And so anyway, yes, that Blinken guy is very important in the Biden administration. And of course, he's been in the council. And like I say, he has lots of family members in the council as well.
Yeah. So going off that, your most recent article, your May 22, 2022 article with the monthly review, Giving War a Chance, provided a really fascinating comparison of who you mentioned before, the CFR member, Kenneth Pollack's book, The Threatening Storm, which was giving insight into the strategic thinking behind the Iraq invasion.
Yeah.
With a more recent book published during last year, done by CFR member Elbridge Colby, Strategy of Denial, which is about great power competition with China and Russia. So could you talk a little bit about how these works reflect the role of the CFR as a planning committee for U.S. foreign policy, as well as how they represent the shifting priorities of the U.S. ruling class?
Yeah, good question. Yes, it's important. So the Gathering Storm, that is the subtitle of this book, was The Case for Invading Iraq. Pretty blunt. And of course, the case was based on oil. We don't want Iraq sitting on all this oil that we could make some profit off of. So we should go to war with Iraq, overthrow Saddam Hussein, and get some concessions into the oil fields. And of course, there was secret planning going on within the Defense Department. It was exactly this goal. And it's interesting that somebody who wasn't in the CFR was he was a leader of the Treasury Department, I think it was. He came into a meeting where he wasn't really invited, but he saw what was going on. And these defense planners, led by Dick Cheney, he's been a member of the Council on Foreign Relations for a long time, and he was a director of the Council on Foreign Relations, not just once, but twice. They have 36 directors. He was a director, and then he went into government, and then he went out of government, he became a director again. So he was a director twice, Council on Foreign Relations, as vice president of W. Bush. Anyway, Cheney was leading this, and they were looking over maps of oil fields in Iraq. This was before the invasion. and saying, okay, this is this oil field, this one, okay, ExxonMobil can have this one, Shell can have that. They were figuring out who was going to get the oil drilling rights. Iraq had oil that was 2 feet below the ground, according to what I read. I'm not an expert in oil fields, but very low, easily tapped oil fields in Iraq that hadn't been tapped. And so they were anxious to get a hold of that. And Saddam Hussein was in the way. So let's have a case for invading Iraq. And this was Kenneth Pollock was a staff person at the Council on Foreign Relations. And of course, in his introduction to his book, he thanks all the council people that helped him with his book, etc. And this book came out, and then lo and behold, within a short length of time, I guess it was only a year or two, the U.S. invades Iraq, takes over, and U.S. war aims were, kind of vague, but they involved oil. And sure enough, after the war is over, the U.S. has some U.S. oil companies are in Iraq. There's a lot of resistance to it. The rank and file of Iraq wanted national oil fields, national control, so they could make the profit. They didn't want to turn it over to foreign corporations, and they were willing to resist. I was in the Alameda County Central Labor Council for a while, representing the National Writers Union. Authors of books can join, and people who make their living writing can join the National Writers Union. So I was in the National Writers Union, the local chapter, and we had one representative on the Labor Council of Alameda County. So I was there when representatives came from Iraq who were labor people who were against the war, U.S. war on Iraq. And they cited incidents of why the U.S. was totally wrong to go in there, of course, greedy, trying to get the oil, and how they resisted. And they said there was one incident where U.S. troops came to take over some facility that the workers and the state of Iraq owned, and U.S. troops came in to take it over. And the oil workers took a tanker that had gasoline, refined gasoline in it, and went underneath it with a box of matches and turned the spigot on. Gasoline's coming out. Told the U.S. troops to get the hell out or else. They were willing to strike the match and blow up that tanker themselves, kill themselves, to get the U.S. troops away from that facility that they wanted to have as a state facility and not controlled by the U.S. corporations. So that's the kind of resistance that the Iraqi working class put up. Very courageous, amazing amount of resistance. And of course, the U.S. was defeated in Iraq in a sense, but they were still able to win enough to get, a lot of influence, including contracts, including the rights to some drilling and some oil, et cetera, in Iraq. So it wasn't a total failure, even though you could say the larger U.S. war aims, Iraq as a satellite state, did not succeed because the resistance of the rank and file, the working class of Iraq, they still got some success. So that was a case, and in my book, Wall Street's Think Tank, I go into detail about how the government officials followed this, Cheney among them, of course, but also other. Condoleezza Rice is another example of a CFR person like Kissinger that came to power in the government through their CFR connection. Condoleezza Rice was a Stanford professor, but her expertise was Russia or Soviet Union. And of course, the CFR has been keen to overthrow the Soviet Union for a very long time, from the time the Soviet Union came into existence. So experts on the Soviet Union, particularly if they're African-American and a woman as well, that's another sidelight that I didn't mention, which I could mention now. The CFR was all male until 1970. Every member was a man. Mostly, of course, 99% white men. But anyway, they were all men until 1970. Then they started letting in a few women slowly. And then even, 45 years later, it's still, 80% men. But they've allowed a significant number of women into it. One of them was Condoleezza Rice. She became active in the council, was invited to become a member. That's how you have You can apply to be in the council, but you have to be invited to be a member by the board of directors. You have to be willing to pay high fees yearly, and they're encouraging you to donate money as well, and write for Foreign Affairs magazine. So Condoleezza Rice came in, so she was the secretary, first the National Security Advisor, then the Secretary of State during this period. And so, of course, she's keen to implement the CFR's program, the case for invading Iraq. So they invaded Iraq and took it over. Now, this new book, Strategy of Denial, is about the US in Asia and the shift, and we should give a little background, the shift to US focus on China as the main threat. And that's changing a little bit now that Russia's become so aggressive and Russia's allying itself with China. But still, Russia's a relatively weak power. China is a pretty strong power and becoming stronger, and it's scaring the US ruling class, the CFR, that their ambitions include hegemony in Asia, which is unacceptable to the CFR and the US ruling class, and hegemony in the world, which is even more unacceptable. So this book came out last year, 2021, and it's the whole point of the book is how you're going to defeat China in Asia and maintain US domination. And he starts out at the very beginning of the book saying, why the United States, why do we care about having US domination in Asia? Well, we care because we're getting a lot of economic benefit from having access to Southeast Asia, access to Taiwan, access to these places. And if you don't have access, if China took over, then they might deprive us of raw materials, they might deprive us of markets, they might deprive us of cheap labor, and we lose out. And then what could happen? What could happen in the United States? And Colby goes into this. What could happen in the United States is you could have unhappiness in the United States, and you could have dissension in the United States, and it could be chaos in the United States because the people there wouldn't be enough crumbs off the table to give to the working class to keep them happy. So we have to have those crumbs. The ruling class doesn't want to give up its billions and vast amounts of billions. And of course, the scale of this is, mind-boggling. The figures that you find, and I can't cite them very well, but, something like 50 billionaires control more wealth than half the population of the United States. It's just ridiculous how much these billionaires control. I don't know how rich they are. Can you imagine, this Musk and people like that, they control over 200 billion. That's $200,000 million. Even if you spent, vast amounts every day, you couldn't spend that in your lifetime. They just want power and money. Of course, Musk is talking about flying to Mars or something and setting up a space colony there with all this wealth. But 200,000 million. He has more than that. I think it's 250,000 million. So anyway, the vast wealth here that the ruling class, because the left has been marginalized, weakened, and kept out of power. You don't let Bernie Sanders go anywhere, and that's a weak left. Bernie Sanders is not, Bernie Sanders is good. I'm glad he's running, et cetera. But as far as a really radical program, the Green Party program was much more radical than Bernie Sanders' program. But it was compared to the Biden program. The Biden program's pathetic compared to Bernie's Green New Deal, for example. Biden's very weak. 2 trillion over 10 years. Bernie's was 16 trillion over 10 years. The Green Party program, Howie Hawkins, and you can look it up on the internet, I think it's probably still up there, 42 trillion over 10 years for a climate program. That's what we need to try to save the planet. We're talking about having a viable planet to live on. Hello, we should spend some money on that. We should tax the rich and spend some real money, 42 trillion, and nationalize the utilities, et cetera. Bernie was in favor of that. Nationalizing utilities. So anyway, in Strategy of Denial, Colby goes into why we have to have Asia as hegemony over Asia, access to Asia, and then goes into what that means. What that means is if China should think of attacking Taiwan, and he's got this, you have to have a big circular power around the island chain and other countries from Japan and South Korea, around to Taiwan and the Philippines, around the arc. If you had a map, you could see over to India, and then all the way to Indonesia, places like that. You surround China with power of different kinds. Countries, aircraft carriers, regular land aircraft carriers, in a sense. Japan has an aircraft carrier off of China. And then your actual military with the bases, all the bases that the United States has. The United States has about 90% of the world's bases, 800 bases, something like that. So you have to prevent, the strategy of denial is denying China getting anything more in Asia, including Taiwan. Now, of course, Taiwan is a prize because of the chips that they produce there. They're high quality chips. I don't know what the percentage is, but it's very high that are produced by Taiwan. So you don't want Taiwan to lose out. Now, what's left out of his analysis, which is, as Biden has been saying when he's been interviewed, yes, we'll go to war over Taiwan. But then his advisors pull that back a little bit so that it's not quite as threatening to China. But Biden is on board with strategy of denial, war with China over Taiwan. And Colby goes into what that means. It means the destruction of the Chinese state, overthrow of the Chinese government, the destruction of the Chinese state, and putting in a different state, a capitalist state. He doesn't say capitalist state, but that's what he has in mind, of course. He overthrow the government of China. And he also goes into nuclear war as an option. Well, hopefully there'll be some limits on the war that's coming between the United States and China. But if we have to go to nuclear chicken, we better not chicken out. Whoever chickens out in the nuclear showdown with the nuclear chicken will lose. So you can't chicken out. Well, this is very scary stuff. We can destroy the planet with these nuclear and destroy humanity with these nuclear weapons. So instead of having a peaceful program, trying to figure out how we can compromise and work together, this is a war. And he says military is dominant. Military affairs are dominant. I don't think that's true, but that's what he believes. And Colby is an interesting figure with this kind of program, which is, it's not a CFR book, but it's published by Yale University Press. And of course, the head of Yale University Press is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. And the people who tout it on the back, there's 5 people that say this is a great book on the back. Well, 3 of them are members of the Council on Foreign Relations. Then he has people that advised him on the book, 42 people. And a lot of those are Council on Foreign Relations people. And there's this guy, Josh Hawley, the senator from Missouri, who gave the fist pump to the January 6th traitors who tried to overthrow the election with a attempted coup with Trump is behind. That guy, he advised Colby on this book as well. But Colby himself is an interesting character. He comes from a family that goes all the way back to John Winthrop's fleet in 1630 to Massachusetts. The first Colby was on that fleet. It was part of the first settlement of Massachusetts, wiping out the Indians, of course, genocide against the Indians, settler colonialism, take over the land resources. The Indians are in the way, so we have to just slaughter them, give them blankets or shoot them down, kill them off, and take the land. So the original Colby was part of that. Then since then, there's been military leaders, at least one Secretary of State. Benbridge Colby was the secretary, one of the secretaries of state in the Wilson administration. And then Colby's grandfather was William Colby, who was the CIA head under Nixon. And before that, he was the head of the Phoenix program in Vietnam. This is Colby's grandfather, William Colby. And he was the head of the Phoenix program, which was a torture and assassination program of civilians in Vietnam. What they did was, we don't know how many thousands were killed and tortured, but they would grab civilians, torture them for any information, and then execute them. And that was William Colby's grandfather was in charge of that program. And the people who studied it said, up to 20-some thousand were killed under this program of seizing civilians. It wasn't done in a war. It was done by grabbing civilians off the street or whatever, their job places, taking them for torture, and then assassinating them. That's his grandfather. And then his father is a capitalist and in the Carlyle group, which the Carlyle group is interesting because the head of Carlyle, the co-chair and the co-founder, Rubenstein, is the chair of the CFR. And Colby has been in the CFR, his father's in the CFR, and his grandfather was in the CFR as well. So they're all CFR people, and they have money. And Eldridge Colby, of course, has investments. When he was in the Trump administration, so he has some neo-fascist leanings, as we could expect. I think the Republican Party now is just a neo-fascist party trying to take over and implement full fascism in the United States. It's extremely dangerous. And so Colby was part of that in the Trump administration. And so he was in favor of some of these things that Trump did because he was in the administration. And he's been also advisor. He'd been in various different groups besides the CFR, Rand Corporation. He's been consulting with them. He's been a consultant for a long time. And he was given money by the Smith Richardson Foundation. They gave him $125,000, I think it was, to help him write the book. And he has investments in Carlyle. When he was in the Trump administration, he had to give a declaration of economic interest. So you could look that up on the internet and see what his ownership was, and there he had big investments in Carlyle. So it gets into private equity. What is private equity, and what does Carlyle do? Maybe we're going to cover that, I think, in another question. But first, why don't we say that this strategy of denial has been put out there by CFR people. That is, they've had podcasts with Eldridge Colby discussing his book, and other groups too. Brookings and Carnegie and a number of others. Wall Street Journal thought the book was great. It was one of the 10 best books of 2021. So it's been promoted by the CFR network. So he was on a CFR podcast talking about it. And the guy that interviewed him was the director of CFR studies. And he said he agreed with Colby on a lot of his politics, his ideas about what to do in regard to China. And said he disagreed with him on a few things, more minor points, but he agreed with him. So the book has had some influence. We haven't gone to war yet, so it's not the same as the threatening storm yet, but it's an early stage of something to watch of the U.S. Now, U.S. and China. Now, if you go back in time, for a while, the United States saw China rising. Say in the 1990s and early 2000s, China was rising. And the best way to handle China, they thought, was to bring China into the World Trade Organization, bring China in, let China take over the China seat at the UN. The CFR favored that. They were in that group. CFR itself, they had study groups on China, where they bring together a lot of diverse people and talk about what to do about China when China was rising. And their consensus was, well, we'll go along with the rise in China because they'll become part of the world order that we're running. It'll be part of our world order, and that'll be good for us. So it's be okay. Then they realized, wait a minute, China has their own hegemony in mind. Xi now doesn't really want to be part of our world order. He wants his own world order. And this is where the United States has an advantage over China, because as a country that's a semi-democracy, and I think the United States is a semi-democracy, we have some, rank and file have some role through elections, and we can demonstrate, I'm not in jail, I haven't been assassinated. If I was in some other countries, I would have been assassinated or in jail, let alone not have just don't have a job in the university. And of course, now I'm too old for the job in the university, but I didn't have a job in the university for a long time. I did teach at several places, but I wasn't rehired. But anyway, so that's the difference. There is an important difference between the United States and China. We have some soft power. China doesn't have that much soft power. They have a lot of hard power. The loans that they can give with the Belt and Road initiative that they have, they're building up their military pretty fast, but they can't challenge the US military. But the US military and US society and US politics has soft power. That is, there's something to be admired about our system because it is entrepreneurial. People can start their own business. People can start their own, news outlet. They can start their own newspaper if they have the money. But you can't do that in many countries, or you'll be, look at Russia. You get arrested if you even demonstrate. There were people holding up blank pieces of paper in Russia when the war started. They were arrested, thrown in jail for 15 years. So there's a difference. We have some soft power. That means we can ally ourselves, not just with Taiwan, but with Japan, with India, with Indonesia, with the Philippines. So we have a big alliance system. So we have an advantage over China in a big alliance system. China's rising. China's getting more powerful. China is a workshop of the world. They're getting very inventive. They're, for the first time recently, they have more inventions. It used to be the patents. The US was #1 in patents. China's #1 in patents now, new patents for new things. So China is rising, but the US has its alliance system is still more powerful. But with this strategy of denial and their ideas about possible war with China, that's pretty scary stuff. And they've given up the idea that China can be part of our world system. No, China wants its own world system, which means that there is going to be a confrontation. And we see that increasingly in the dialogue between the two sides. Conflict is getting more severe. And I think that it's dangerous, very dangerous. And the rank and file needs to, try to assert itself on this because we don't want a nuclear war. We don't want any war. Is because that could extinguish humanity. And we owe it to future generations to try to have humanity survive and a livable planet to survive. So the two existential threats, of course, are to humanity's survival or nuclear war and climate chaos. It's not just climate change that's going on, it's climate chaos. And we see that all around us with the storms we're seeing, fires we're seeing, the floods we're seeing, and the pollution of the ocean that we're seeing. We got to get on a different road as a human species, or we're going to have species extinction, unfortunately. And we owe it to the past and owe it to the future generations to preserve humanity and the option that they would have to create a society that we should have, which I believe is an ecological socialist society, fully democratic, run by the rank and file, for the rank and file. That is, run by the workers, for the workers, where there wouldn't be billionaires running things. There would be the workers running things. From the factory floor to the presidential suite, we should have working class running things in a democratic fashion, fully democratic. And that's actually what Marx, Marx unfortunately is maligned because people associate Stalin's Russia with Marx. No, not at all. Marx didn't want the big state. He wanted the withering away of the state. The state's another oppressive force. Marx didn't want the big state. He didn't want the capitalists running things either. He saw this all as really bad stuff for the rank and file, for the workers. And we have to have full democracy, run a society run by and for the working class in an ecological fashion for us to survive as a human species. Anyway, I got a little bit sidetracked there, but it's all connected.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that was great. Since we already touched on Carla a bit, I might maybe we just close it out with this the last question on NATO.
Uh-huh.
How do you feel the special interests represented in the CFR influence NATO policy in Ukraine and Eastern Europe?
Yeah, well, NATO was seen by go back to some of the theorists of the CFR, which I haven't mentioned this yet. I mentioned Kissinger. He was an important theorist. He wrote this book, Nuclear Weapons and Foreign Policy. In 1956, a CFR book. In 1956, Kissinger wrote that as a CFR fellow. Anyway, as far as another one of these CFR intellectuals was Zbigniew Brzezinski. He is an exile from Poland. His father was a diplomat and they lived in Canada in World War II, so he was able to survive. But he was a ruling class leader from Poland and became an intellectual, Harvard intellectual. And he said that Ukraine was kind of one of the pivots of the world geopolitically. And if you have Ukraine on your side, geopolitically, that gives you a lot of power. But if Ukraine's on the other side, Russia, China, that gives them a lot of power. Now, so geopolitically, its position is seen as important geopolitically. And there's one of those pivots for a Eurasian power structure, which is what Putin and Xi are developing, a Eurasian power structure. Now, Xi is a little cautious because Putin is looking like a failure. This looks like it was a big mistake, a blunder, and he keeps blundering. And you're reminded of what happened in 1917 when the Tsar kept sending, Russian workers and peasants to their death in World War I. We know what happened. The Russian people overthrew the Tsar, and the Soviet Union came into being after that. You're reminded of that. When Russian army gets defeated, it affects the political structure. And Putin is doubling down, as we've seen, with these, call-ups that he's doing. But there's a lot of rebellion going on too. Some places in the Soviet Union, they're starting blockades, so the guys that are going to be giving orders for call-ups are being blockaded, kept out. And of course, the police can break the blockade. And they think violence will solve all these problems. If you arrest enough people, if you commit enough violence on the soldiers, they will do what you want. Well, not necessarily. Soldiers have guns. They can decide maybe at some point, we don't know, whether Putin should be overthrown. Of course, that's the goal of the United States and NATO, is to overthrow Putin and get Ukraine, keep Ukraine under Western policy. Ukraine is split. Western part of Ukraine is oriented towards the Eastern, the EU, and the eastern part of Ukraine is unknown, but certainly more people are Russian supporters in the eastern part of Ukraine. Ukraine has a lot of resources too. The US and the West has gotten behind on this rare earths and those kind of minerals. Well, Ukraine's one source, big source. China's the main source now of rare earths, which you need for certain magnets, for example, for the wind power. You need magnets. China's got the rare earths because we have rare earths here in the United States, but China could do them so much cheaper. We've just been buying them from China. Well, now we have to have a crash program to get rare earths because we need them for climate change issues. So anyway, I saw somewhere that Ukraine has 112 different minerals and rare earths out of 120 something that are needed. So it's a mineral center. It has some industry. It's, as we know, it's agricultural. It's very rich. They've got a tremendous soil. One of the main bread baskets of the world is Ukraine. So in terms of its economy, it's very important. In terms of its geographic position, it's very important. So these are reasons why the Council on Foreign Relations, the ruling class, both in the EU and also the United States, wants that as an open door, the grand area. They want that to be a place that they can go into. If Russia takes over, well, the door is going to close. So there's reasons why they want to keep it. The US lost a tremendous chance to have a peaceful world when the Soviet Union collapsed. Because when the Soviet Union collapsed, that was the opening and people were advocating for an end to NATO. Why do you need NATO? The Soviet Union's collapsed. Let's just have a peaceful world. Let's have agreements with Russia. We'll get along. No, they didn't want to do that. They wanted to have continued NATO and take advantage of Russia. Russia's weak now. Oh, we can we can have the open door in Russia now because it's very weak under Yeltsin. Well, that wasn't going to last forever. A strongman is the historical tradition, strongman of Russia. So a strongman came back in, who's now kind of a fascist. He's a classic fascist. I think, and it's interesting that Putin was saying, "Oh, we have to conquer Ukraine because they're fascists there." Well, fascists in a country are up to that country to deal with. It's not some other country should invade a country to destroy the fascists. No, it's that own country has to deal with its own fascists. So that's wrong. And it's interesting that if Putin wants to find fascists, he just needs to look in the mirror. He's an ethno-nationalist. He talks about Russia, the great Russia, etc. He's very repressive, just like Hitler. You can't demonstrate, you can't dissent. You'll be assassinated, you'll be thrown in jail. It's an oligarchic rule. It's a kleptocracy. That's what Germany was under the Nazis. They stole everything they could get their hands on, all the paintings that Europe had, all the wealth that Jewish people had, etc. Unions are destroyed in Russia. The working class doesn't have a voice. And they, of course, most of them have been destroyed in the United States, but there are at least some around in the United States. And at least you can organize with difficulty in the United States. So there's some differences there. But anyway, there's a fascist system there. And it's right that Putin should not have invaded. NATO was wrong. I mean, I try to take a balanced view of this whole thing. NATO was wrong to advance its NATO to the borders of Russia. That although in the defense of NATO, it's a defensive alliance, and they said that these countries, Poland, Lithuania, etc., wanted to join into NATO. They didn't want to turn them down. Well, they should have turned them down, and people like Kissinger and George Kennan advised that. But the consensus was under Clinton, let's let all these countries join NATO. They didn't let Ukraine join NATO, but they did let these other countries join. I try to take a balanced view. So I criticize NATO for that. And of course, for not disbanding and for moving to Russia's border, especially since Russia lost so much in World War II fighting the Nazis. They had 20-some million people killed. Imagine the tremendous suffering on that large part of their country destroyed. And then the US would not help them after the war, wouldn't give them any more money like the Marshall Plan, wouldn't give it to Western Europe, wouldn't give it to Eastern Europe. That was the CFR speaking, saying, no, we don't want to help, right? We want to destroy Soviet Union. That's part of our grand area that we want. And so we're going to try to destroy them. But they didn't, reason why they didn't want Russia to get into NATO, because Russia wanted to get in NATO too. Why don't we join NATO, they said. The United States didn't want that, because if Russia was in NATO and Germany was in NATO, which it was, imagine what would happen with Germany needing the Russian resources, the Russian oil, the Russian gas, the Russian minerals. There would have been a tendency for an alliance between Russia and Germany, which would undermine US control of NATO. So that's why the United States didn't want to disband NATO and wanted to take advantage of Russia. But they also didn't want Russia to join NATO, because then Germany and Russia could unite, and that would be a problem for them. So that's why that happened. So that's the one side of it. I'm critical of NATO, critical of the United States, but the other side of it, there was no justification for an aggressive war against Ukraine. Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons, made an agreement with Russia in 1991. We'll give up our nuclear weapons for a non-aggression treaty. Russia signed the non-aggression treaty. They've invaded a sovereign country which wants to be independent. They're engaged in atrocities, horrible things. There's 13 million Ukrainians that become refugees. It's just horrible. It's a time when humanity should be devoting our energies to solving the climate chaos. It's devoted to war, which causes more climate chaos, militarism. The biggest emitter of climate gases, greenhouse gases, is the US military. I'm sure the Russian and Ukrainian military now are challenging the US military for emissions champions and more emissions. This is extremely horrible for the world and dangerous for the future of humanity. So Putin should not have invaded, so I condemn that. And I take issue with some of my friends who tend to excuse Putin. I don't think there's any excuse for aggressive war on a sovereign state. Even if you've got NATO on your border, that's not an excuse to invade another sovereign country and commit atrocities as well. So I condemn both sides, neither Washington nor Moscow. That's my view on that. So there's a few things on that particular issue. And
Well,
maybe that's all we need to talk about. You've got quite a bit of data there.
a ton, yeah.
You
No,
can edit
thank
it
you.
as you wish.
No, I'll leave it all because I think it's super useful information for people to really understand these power structures in a clear way, and like you said, work towards making a better world,
Yeah.
identifying them.
Well, thank you for all your efforts on that regard in your organization. I appreciate the offer of coming on your program. And how can I see it? I guess I just get on the podcast on your website, right?
Yeah,
I want to look at it myself, or if I have friends that want to look at it.
definitely. I am going to.
When would it come